Chapter 11. Dare awoke in blackness. She blinked to be certain that her eyes were open, but she remained blind. So much for her plan. She hoped the elven spy had gotten away, and that Caleb had been far from the manor. Darkness curled around her skin. It was thick and heavy, and she couldn't shake it off. Lengths of chains weighed down her wrists and neck as she stirred. She tasted copper in her mouth at the realization. Her breathing amplified, matching pace with her furious heart. Pain needled its way down her injured arm as she squirmed. It was instantly forgotten as the chains tightened their coils like pythons, moving on their own. In reflex, she jerked her hands up to her neck. The chains wound tighter, and she began to choke. She fought against the terror rising in her throat, but panic crashed over her like a tidal wave. She yanked against her restraints. She tugged, thrashed, and kicked. The chains kept constricting, kept squeezing their cold metal into her skin. She heaved against the collar as it tightened more against her neck. She fought for a single breath and opened her mouth to yell with all the air she had left. She cut off her scream, biting her tongue so sharply that it bled. Now she held on to the air she had and was too afraid to breathe. How tight could the chains cinch? Would they kill her? Straining to control each muscle, she forced herself to stay still. Slowly, carefully, she inhaled a tiny bit. Slowly, carefully, she let the breath back out. She made herself remain motionless when all she wanted to do was kick and scream. As she tried to breathe, ever so slightly, despair sank through her fright, just as the coldness seeped through her skin. Who had chained her here? What did they want? Silent tears treaded down her cheeks, but she didn't sob. She didn't dare. Dare didn't know how long she had waited in the darkness on the verge of choking when the door to the cell opened. It shut immediately. She flinched and then scolded herself for doing so. She was tough in the face of danger and wasn't going to show any fear. She could stand pain. She'd worked on a farm for her whole life, after all. And she implored herself to believe that she wasn't lying right now. She didn't attempt to crane her neck to look at whoever may have entered, if anyone even had. She'd heard no footsteps. A masculine voice shattered the silence. "Answer my questions, and I will grant you a quick death." He must have touched the chains because they rustled and the pressure around her throat eased. She swallowed, afraid to speak, but the chains didn't move at her motion this time. She gulped for air. "Who?" "Did the prince escape?" She coughed. "What prince?" There was no reply. "Oh," she sagged. "He was a prince. An elven prince." She tried to picture it, but didn't have the energy, and the gravity of Caleb's identity remained distant. She summoned her strength and sat up straight. "Well, unless you bastards, whoever you are, have him, then yes, he did. That was a stupid question." There was the wind of an indrawn breath. "I do not think you understand what hell has swallowed you." She spat a laugh. "I really don't. I don't even know who you are." "Of course you don't. Now, I can save you from pain beyond your imagination, or you can continue with this stultifying bravado, and I will leave you to burn." Finally, her mouth began to dry. "What do you know about the elf you were traveling with?" She parted her lips to say something about Caleb leaving them behind on the road, but she realized that she didn't know how to tell anything but the bedrock truth. In fact, she even hesitated when trying to compliment her brother's atrocious cooking, let alone attempt to deceive an enemy that had her chained to the floor. She tried not to stir as she spoke. Just that he was the outlaw, framed by whoever you are, and going to meet someone at the Count's. I didn't even know that he was an elf for most of it, and I didn't know he was a prince at all.
Is that everything?
She sighed. It is. She flinched as she imagined hearing the whispery rasp of steel sliding free of a scabbard, but there was no sound from across the room. She slammed her eyes shut and squeezed them tightly, readying her good arm to swing the heavy weight of the chain. It might be the only chance she'd have. She lifted the links, which still didn't move on their own, just as the door shoved inward. This time it was left ajar and light filtered in. 2 men whisked through the opening. She squinted and could make out the slim shape of the voice's owner stand at attention next to the door. She studied the speaker, despite the dim light, but he appeared no different from the 2 that had just entered. They were tall and lean, but they looked human, or at least had the veneer of it. Their dark hair was styled in the same glued-to-their-heads appearance, and they moved in dark, flowing clothes that seemed too thin to withstand everyday use. She stared hard, trying to find a mark or defining trait on the speaker. He wore a sword, while the other 2 did not. Then she heard Kelin's screams through the open door. She froze and trembled at the pain squeezed out of his wails. But she also felt her own blood steaming. She lifted her handful of chain, readying to throw or hit with it. She wanted to hurl it now, but she gritted her teeth. She needed the right moment. The 2 newcomers turned to the speaker. There were some snapping words in a language she did not comprehend. The original speaker saluted, bowed, and exited the room. She ignored him. Kelin was the only thing in her mind. The screaming cut off as the door to her cell slammed shut. He's alive, she breathed. A candle flared into life.
For perhaps the next hour.
This man pushed his words through a much heavier accent than the other. She almost couldn't understand him. She brought her chin up toward her captors. The one holding the candle leaned over her. She blinked when she saw his eyes. She had never seen orange eyes before. She wanted to recoil but forced herself to remain still. What are you? A slow smile crept across his countenance.
We are Kelin, little mortal.
But the Kelin don't exist. Fear singed her throat anew. His grin became crooked as his face hovered over hers.
History has failed humans, I see.
Dare heaved the chain up with all her strength, aiming for his nose. The man didn't have time to move. Inches away from his face, the chain wrenched her wrist back and against the wall. The collar tightened again, and she wrenched for air she was no longer getting. The Kelin didn't exist. Old campfire stories loomed up in her mind. But now those unimaginable horrors of ancient stories were all too easy to imagine. She saw blackness tickling the edges of her vision as she struggled to gasp. A chuckle stung the air. The speaker snapped his fingers and the collar unlocked itself and fell from her neck. She crashed forward to her knees and one hand while grabbing her throat with her other hand, hacking and panting. Both of the Kelin stood back and waited. The one who had spoken snapped his fingers again and the chains around her wrists pulled her upright against the wall. The speaker floated in front of her.
Where is the prince?
He asked, in a voice laced with honey. Dare tried to glare. told you. Don't know anything." He swept closer, almost pressing his face into hers.
"I'm certain you are aware of more than you believe. Tell us whatever you're thinking about the prince right now."
She swallowed, and had never considered how such a small, usual thing could hurt so much. She narrowed her gaze at the speaker and realized she'd be damned if this slick bastard was going to best her so easily. She bit down on another cough. "Why? I'm going to get it anyway because I've never heard of a nice torturer." His smile withered. He growled something to the other Kelin in their language, and the second Kelin stepped forward with a large metal tray that he set on the floor. Dare heard the thunder in her heart as she stared. There was a small razor, glass funnels, and a glass cylinder full of clear liquid on the tray. She didn't understand any of it. The first Kelin lifted the razor between his thumb and forefinger and regained his smile.
"I believe fear drives people to say things before torment, such as the fear of disfiguration, the loss of your fingers, one at a time, losing your nose, your ears, and so on. However, I believe that people need to know the kiss of pain first to truly fear the worst."
He ripped off the dwarven bandage. Then he sliced the blade across her arms, collarbones, and through her clothing into her stomach, ribs, and legs. She barely recognized the touch of the metal itself, just pinches where it cut. He was quick and silent. She felt her own hot blood leaking across her skin. However, this wasn't hurting too badly, and that left her even more confused. The Kelin lifted the glass funnels with their fingertips. The devices were needle-thin on the narrow end. Dare wasn't sure exactly what they were doing, but her mouth dried out all the same. They inserted the thin ends of the funnels into the dozen or so small cuts and pressed them in deeply enough to stand on their own. Then they poured the liquid from the jar into her body, and whatever it was began to burn. The Kelin who had not spoken seized her chin and tipped up what was left in the jar into her mouth. She tried not to swallow, but he held her mouth closed until she did. Pain flamed up inside her chest. She tried to will herself to vomit as she wrenched against the chains. She tried to yell, but found she couldn't. Her body went into spasms. She knocked most of the glass tubes out of her skin in her thrashing. The first Kelin stepped back with enthusiasm etched across his face.
"This is acid, girl. Do you know what acid is?"
She tried breaking free, but the chains kept her clutched against the wall. The burning roared louder throughout her body with every heartbeat, and she couldn't extinguish the flames. He chuckled and continued in a sing-song voice she could barely register through the inferno.
"Acid melts things, even metal and stone, and you are experiencing what it can do to a mortal coil. This is too weak to kill you quickly. After all, I did say we'd start with smaller pains."
She coughed again and failed to see her blood splash across the floor as pain continued to rip through her body with fury. She felt nothing in her mouth anymore or where they had cut her. The acid had burned away sensation in those areas, but everywhere else more than made up for that. The Kelin drifted above her face.
"Imagination failing? The acid is burning holes through your body. It's dissolving your bones and muscles. Now,"
his voice became coaxing,
"I can stop this. Can you still hear me? I can make it all stop with one quick stroke of my knife. Pray tell me, where did the prince go?"
Dare opened her mouth but could no longer say anything, even if she wanted to. She flopped against the wall like a dying fish. but she made herself look him in the eyes and cough blood onto him.